So just to mention again, for the people who are going to be seeing it on YouTube, we had a problem with the visual on my computer, so you will be able to hear me. I'm Eddie O'Brien, but you will only be able to hear me and the questions I'll be asking. But thankfully, you will be able to see Ambassador Freeman. A couple of quick things by way of introduction. Welcome to the Thinking Centre here in Ireland, even if you can't see it. I founded the Thinking Centre 10 years ago here in Ireland. It was my partner, Catherine Morrissey, that came up with the name Thinking Centre. And just one other quick thing with some background of myself. For about the last 30 years, I've been deeply involved in exploring a new form of dialogue. And I'm mentioning that because also I am aware of how much appreciation Ambassador Freeman gives to the concept of dialogue. I'm guessing that the interview with the questions I'm going to be asking Ambassador Freeman will probably take somewhere between 30 and 40 minutes. And then, of course, there will be time to put your questions in the chat. And if you can also put your contact details if you want, and then it means that you get further information in future about events like this. The first thing, the first thing, also the first part of the interview will be involved primarily with the Ukraine-Russia issue, and the second part will involve what's going on in Gaza. As you will have seen from the information I sent out, I use the term missing information because my experience being involved in dialogue for so long and in other aspects of my life is that missing information is just as problematical as misinformation. And I'm very much assured that Ambassador Freeman will be able to provide all of us probably with a lot of important missing information. Because when there is this narrative, we, as human beings, narratives have a huge influence on the way we think about things. But then you can have a situation where you have a narrative which is very lopsided or is only one-sided. And that becomes quite a problem. And for whatever reason, we seem to live in a world at the moment where some narratives dominate and others are excluded. And having said of that part anyway, I want to just read out an introduction to Ambassador Freeman. Ambassador Freeman is a former US Assistant Secretary of Defense and former US Ambassador to Saudi Arabia. He was Principal US Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs and Acting US Commissioner for Refugee Affairs. Ambassador Freeman is the author of 5 books, including America's Misadventures in the Middle East, numerous articles on statecraft, and editor of the Encyclopedia Britannica's article on diplomacy. In addition to Chinese, Ambassador Freeman speaks French and Spanish at the professional level and can converse in Arabic and several other languages. So one of the aspects I would like to ask to start my questions to Ambassador Freeman. In Ireland, and it seems in much of Europe, and as far as I'm aware, to some degree in the United States as well, there it seems to be a narrative that Russia were unprovoked and invaded Ukraine. So one of the first questions I would like to ask Ambassador Freeman, in his opinion, what was the Russian invasion unprovoked?
No, it was not unprovoked. We began to hear as early as 1994 from Boris Yeltsin, before Vladimir Putin came to power, that the expansion of NATO and the presence of hostile forces on Russia's borders was unacceptable and would draw a military reaction. That reaction was actually further signaled during the brief war between Georgia and Russia. And there should have been no surprise. The war began actually as a civil war between Ukrainians, Russian speakers, and Ukrainian speakers in 2014, after the coup d'etat in Kiev, when the new ultranationalist government in Kiev outlawed the use of Russian, Hungarian, Romanian, and other minority languages at the local level, so that the Russian speakers, who were predominant in eastern Ukraine, in some cases 75% in Crimea, but sometimes as much as 90% in the eastern oblasts, rebelled, and Russia naturally supported them. So they wanted the right to use Russian to educate their children and to communicate with the local administrations. This actually resulted in a negotiation, 2 agreements at Minsk, sponsored by France and Germany, which were agreed to by the Russians, confirming that the Donbass region, Luhansk and Donbass, and Donetsk would remain part of Ukraine, but on a basis similar to that of Quebec in Canada. That is, they would be allowed to have their own language as an official language and educate their children in that language. That agreement was then reputed. It was first vigorously endorsed by Zelensky when he ran for president. And then when he came into office, it was repudiated, at which point Angela Merkel of Germany and François Hollande of France both said, well, we didn't really mean that agreement. It was just a means of gaining time for us to arm and train the Ukrainian armed forces against Russia. So the provocation began with attacks by ultranationalist Ukrainians on fellow Ukrainians who happened to be Russian-speaking in the East. It escalated to a Russian intervention against those ultranationalist Ukrainians. That went on for 8 years. 15,000 people died from barrages of artillery into the Russian-speaking areas. And eventually, in December 2021, Vladimir Putin demanded negotiations on 3 topics. One was a halt to any talk of bringing Ukraine into NATO, or the implication that American and other anti-Russian forces would be stationed on Russia's borders. The second was to reaffirm the Minsk Accords and the autonomy of Russian speakers in the East, and by implication, Hungarians and Romanians as well. There are other minorities in Ukraine. And finally, of course, a broad discussion of European security architecture, with Ukraine as a neutral party to that, rather on the model of the Austrian State Treaty of 1955, which was reached at the height of the Cold War, which guaranteed Austria's independence and democracy and required Austria to treat its minorities, Italians in the Tyrol, Slovenes, Hungarians, in the manner that the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe requires. So those were the 3 items for negotiation. They remain the 3 items for negotiation. There's one major difference, which is that Russia, now having had to go to war in against Ukraine and occupying the all or part of the 4 Russian-speaking oblasts in the east, now demands to keep them because it does not trust guarantees from Ukraine that, in fact, anything like the Minsk Accords is now possible to be implemented. So I'll end here. And I think that's a very brief history of the thing. There are many, many twists and turns in this, of course.
And Ambassador, so was there also a sort of a provocation coming from the United States and Western Europe? Was there an element of provocation the way they were behaving?
Yes, essentially Putin and his government demanded a negotiation. They were answered by both the United States and Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary General of NATO, with a flat refusal to discuss any of these topics. The only issue that we were prepared to discuss was limitations on stationing missiles and other armaments in Ukraine. So basically, in statecraft, if you cannot obtain satisfaction for your national interests by peaceful means, the alternative is to use force, and that's what Russia then did. So the provocation was the refusal to discuss things. And now that has, for 3 years, been the case. We've just seen in Riyadh an end to that period with a meeting between Americans and Russians at the foreign minister level, which has agreed on 4 points. First, that the embassies in Moscow, the American embassy in Moscow and the Russian embassy in Washington, will be restored to full functionality by a process of tit for tat expulsions. They had essentially been gutted and become very ineffectual. So the embassies will be restored in order to enable a normal diplomatic relationship. Second, there will be continued dialogue at the foreign minister level, and this will be accompanied by the appointment of negotiating teams by the 2 sides to try to hammer out the parameters of peace for Ukraine, normalized US-Russian relations, and some sort of approach to a broader peace in Europe. Not very clear what all that will mean. But basically, it's positive, even though it initially excludes both Ukraine and the Europeans, because this dialogue had to start, and there has to be some basic agreement on the principles that will guide further discussion. And then the final point is that the Ukrainians and the EU will be brought into this discussion once parameters have been agreed. There is a great deal of discord and anger at this development, which is unilateral. It is sudden. There was no prior consultation of any consequence with the EU or within NATO or with Ukraine. On the other hand, Mr. Trump has been on record from the very beginning saying that this is what he intended to do. He won the election. The question is, on the American side, why is it that the Ukrainians and the EU, European members of NATO, did not initiate a consultation about what this meant? And the answer seems to be because they don't know what to do. We've just seen a rump meeting of a small group of EU states in Paris, with Britain joining the meeting, even though it's no longer a member of the European Union. And they labored for 3.5 hours and, like the mountains, produced a ridiculous mouse, if anything.
Sorry, Ambassador, they produced what? Did you say?
Ridiculous moose in Latin, a ridiculous mouse.
Right.
That is Horace. Anyway, so Uh, we now have the most unseemly and I think utterly counterproductive exchange of diatribe, insults, and accusations between our mercurial president and Mr. Zelensky, who, in my view, was led down the garden path to disaster um, and doesn't like where he is. So there we are at present. What happens next is the meeting between the negotiating teams, and we will begin to see what happens. But I'll make a final observation, and that is that the shock within the EU and NATO, and especially in the UK, is the result of the fact that we've all been living in the midst of the most intensive information warfare the world has ever seen. You have people who thought that it was a good idea, this is the Biden administration, not to discuss anything with the adversary on the battlefield. How that was supposed to accomplish anything is unclear, but there was no diplomacy at all. There was only fighting. The fighting steadily escalated amidst claims that Ukraine was winning, which was palpably false, amid claims that the Russian casualties vastly outnumbers those of Ukraine, which is also false, and amid repeated claims that the introduction of some new weapon, Wunderwaffen, would cure everything on the battlefield in favor of Ukraine. None of those things were true. And so people who believe those things, which is the majority in both Europe and America, but not the majority in the rest of the world, where there was great skepticism, now confront reality. The reality is completely at odds with what they've been told for the last 3 years. So naturally, this is a shock.
Yes. So when you mentioned there about there had been no diplomacy, apparently I understand Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State, had refused to sit down with the Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov and would even refuse to take a phone call. And there was no conversation with Russia behind the scenes. For somebody like you, with your experience, that must have come across as astonishing.
It was an astonishing mistake. There is a military adage that one should never lose contact with the enemy, because if you do, you're liable to be flanked or surprised somehow. The same is true in international relations. You should never lose contact with an adversary. The model here actually is Chinese. People don't remember, but in 1962, when the Sino-Indian border war broke out, China kept its embassy in Delhi open, did not withdraw it, which is the European custom. Similarly, in 1979, when there was fighting along the Sino-Vietnamese border, the Chinese embassy in Hanoi did not close. Why? Because it's precisely during a war that you most need diplomatic contact. Lincoln was in office for 4 years. He never once visited Moscow. Sergei Lavrov, a very, very able foreign minister of Russia, capable of being charming and, if necessary, obnoxious, two sides of the same coin, perhaps, never visited Washington for his 5 years. Blinken and Lavrov ran into each other, or I should say ricocheted off each other at various international gatherings, but never spoke for more than 10 minutes and never exchanged more than pleasantries about, pleasant things they'd seen and done. The sort of thing you do at the dinner table with relatives you don't like. This is a tremendous lapse. And it has, as an American diplomat, it really quite astonished me.
Yeah, and about 18 months ago, we at the Thinking Centre here, we had the conference which had Ray McGovern and Jeffrey Roberts, Professor Jeffrey Roberts. And at that particular time, I was motivated to organize that because it appeared to me that there was an awful lot of information that people didn't have. And if people don't have a certain amount of facts, particularly verifiable facts, and somehow or another are either being excluded from seeing those facts or are excluding themselves from considering them, it of course then leads to extremely dangerous situations. And back then, when Ray McGovern and uh, Professor Roberts, it, that particular conference is on our website, and it's quite remarkable because when you're talking about something 18 months ago, you don't know the future. But given the future that's now after unfolding, it really is quite extraordinary how right a lot of what they shared at that conference was. And I just want to quickly say, Professor uh, Roberts was recently sort of attacked by an Irish member of the European Parliament, and then he was attacked in a newspaper article. And I wrote to the newspaper when I saw the article. And what I wrote, and I'll be very brief here, but I just want to anchor it back into what you're really talking about as well, Ambassador, which is the importance of communication. But what I wrote to the newspaper and what I wrote in was published. Here in the 32 counties of Ireland, our recent history has surely taught us the crucial importance of dialogue and communication. It has been discovered that when dialogue is avoided, an absence of open communication leads people to make assumptions about each other or about situations that they only hear about secondhand, which may or may not be correct. People may then continue to view each other through these assumptions, which gives further weight to the inaccuracy or incompleteness of these assumptions to begin with. So it seems that for whatever reason, and even though these latest moves have been made by the Trump administration to have communication with Russia, there's still extraordinary things being said by people on the Western side and in the Western media. For example, Mark Rutte, NATO Secretary General, recently said, I am telling you very clearly, we must prepare for war. Denmark Defence Intelligence Service last week stated that Russia would be able to move against another neighbor in as little as 6 months. My question is, as I'm not in politics, but surely do people in those situations not realize that if they don't, I mean, how many of those people have had a conversation with the Russian side? Has Ireland's representatives had a conversation with Lavrov? I don't know. I suspect maybe not, because in the Western media, there is all this type of sort of fearful things occurring.
Well, Ireland has the merit of being neutral and should have a dialogue with everyone. Um, and it's surprising if it has not had that. But I think we live in an age in which three things have come together. One is the habit of democracies to demonize their enemies in a war. That has happened with a vengeance. Mr. Putin is now regarded as the incarnation of evil. Actually, if you listen to him, which it's very hard to do because media channels are blocked, censored, in the interest of the information war. But if you do listen to him, he often makes a great deal of sense. He's clearly a strategic reasoner, and he has a good grasp of history from the Russian perspective, which you might not agree with, but at least he has an informed perspective. The second thing that's happened, excuse me, is that our communication in the political sphere is now online and controlled by media oligopolies, which have been essentially encouraged by governments to censor the communications of those who use them. So this has become a big issue everywhere. I think it was most unjust of J.D. Vance to accuse Europeans of doing this when, in fact, we are doing it in the United States, despite the First Amendment to our Constitution. So that's the second thing. That is demonization. The third is the advent of political correctness. So if you do not adhere to the herd mentality, if you express a dissenting opinion, or if you try to introduce facts that do not accord with the narrative, you are pilloried, as appeared to have happened to Professor Robertson. So I think these three things are mentally deadening. And we know from psychologists that if you repeat a falsehood long enough, it becomes an axiom that can't be questioned. And that is exactly what has happened to us in the description of this warfare. I think it's notable that, Russian channels of communication, of course, the Russians engage in propaganda, everyone does. I wouldn't say their propaganda is particularly effective, but good propaganda has to have a fixed relationship with the truth. And the final thing that has happened given all these issues that I've mentioned, is that we live in a world in which everything is plausible and nothing is true. And we can't tell what is wrong and what is right anymore. We have fallen victim to social media, which are like petri dishes for conspiracy theories. They connect you. If you believe that there are trolls under the bridge about to come out and get you, and you're on Facebook or some other social media outlet, they will put you in touch with other people who share your belief. And pretty soon you will have a conversation with no one who disagrees with you on that subject, even though the trolls are without any empirical evidence whatsoever. Everybody will believe in them. And that is what has happened in this context. And it's happened in others. You can look at the cover up on the genocide in Palestine, for example. You can look at the demonization of Iran. You can look, in the case of the United States, at the demonization of China. Many untruths now regarded as axiomatic. So we have a grave problem, Eddie, when we try to introduce facts as opposed to what the first Trump administration called alternative facts, which are not facts at all, but statements masquerading as facts.
Yes, and in a conversation you and I were having last week, Ambassador, you said something which I consider to be extremely profound and to some degree gives a psychological basis for some of these things that are occurring. What you said was there is a difference between empathy and sympathy. And what struck me when you said that was it's it's mirrored in, so if people are not operating out of empathy but out of sympathy, they will tend to gravitate towards those other people who have the same views. But the empathy means an all-inclusive consideration. And I just felt that statement you made was really profound.
Well, if I'd said something profound, that must have been an accident. But I think I come at this as a practitioner of diplomacy. And empathy is the basis for diplomacy. The purpose of diplomacy is to persuade another party to accept your view of that party's interests and what would benefit that party. In other words, to persuade the other party to do what you want that party to do, because that party has been convinced that it is in its own interest to do that. That's what diplomacy is all about. In order to persuade someone to see things your way, you have to understand how they see things and why they see those things. And that is empathy. And it is very different from sympathy, because sympathy implies agreement. Empathy does not imply agreement. It implies nothing other than understanding. And so the lack of distinction between these things is very evident in charges of political correctness against dissidents. You explain something because you understand it, and it is therefore charged that you are sympathizing with it. So if you look at Ukraine, you could say, well, of course, the Russian invasion of Ukraine was utterly illegal under international law. It should never have happened. And interestingly, apparently, initially, Mr. Zelensky and the Ukrainian establishment understood that. And so at Istanbul in March of 2022, barely a month after the invasion occurred, Russia, with the mediation of Turkey and the then Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, reached an agreement and a draft treaty, which they signed, initialed. Of course, at referendum, it was to be ratified in a meeting between Zelensky and Putin. And our good friend Boris Johnson then suddenly flew to Kyiv and apparently delivered a message to the Ukrainians that, well, you may be ready for peace, but we're not, which illustrates that the purpose of the war, to the extent it had any purpose, was not to do anything for Ukraine, which has suffered terribly in this war, but to, in the words of Lloyd Austin, the then Secretary of Defense, to weaken and isolate Russia. So it was a strategic move, and we were prepared to fight to the last Ukrainian to achieve it. And we are now down to pretty close to the last Ukrainian, which is why Wunderwaffen, wonderful weapons of some major new kind, are not going to produce a setback to the Russians. The problem Ukraine has is it's lost too many men and women, and it just can't carry on an offensive. This is why the incursion in Kursk into Russia is such a disaster, because Ukraine sent its very best surviving troops in there, presumably to prepare for a trade-off of territories in a negotiation, and they are being devastated. Their defense perimeter is steadily contracting, and even without the North Koreans. By the way, we don't know, the North Koreans are supposedly fighting there until they're not, then they come back. But the interesting thing is they very conveniently commit suicide rather than being captured. So who has seen a North Korean interviewed, a prisoner of war from North Korea? You know, there may be North Koreans fighting there. Kim Jong-un, the dictator of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, has wanted to have his troops tested in combat and to be battle hardened. And he's getting that if in fact his troops are there. But we really can't tell. This goes back to nothing being absolutely true and everything plausible. We don't really know. We don't have any evidence that the North Koreans really are there. So I think this is just an illustration of the way in which we've been deprived of realistic information about what is happening on the battlefield. And a final observation, of course, what you lose on the battlefield, you can't regain at the negotiating table. The parameters, the outcome of the battlefield determines what is possible in terms of post-war reconciliation. I think you understand this in Ireland very well.
Yeah.
So that is a reality. When I hear people complain about we're giving away everything to Putin. The fact is, Putin's grabbed a lot, and we can't take it away from him. So we need to be realistic about this.
Yeah, because the logic, as and clearly would say, going back to what you were saying about what happened in Istanbul in March of 2022, that this extra that land, that territory that has captured was was caused then by the Americans and the British at that meeting, because if they hadn't blocked that event, if that event had taken place, well, then there was apparently this agreement where Ukraine would be neutral. It was would be a completely different outcome to where we are at the moment.
Well, the odd thing is sometimes I think the most endearing characteristics of Americans, of whom I'm one, is our amnesia. We don't know, we have Alzheimer's. We can hide our own Easter eggs, and we don't know what happened in the past. In 1962, when the Soviet Union attempted to place weapons 90 miles from our shores in Cuba, we went berserk. Fortunately, John F. Kennedy was a sound leader, reliable. He did conduct the back channel communications, Eddie, that you lament did not happen during this war. And in the end, a face-saving method of ending that confrontation was reached. It involved removing missiles that the United States had clandestinely placed in Turkey, aimed at hitting Russia from the south, just as the Russian missiles in Cuba were aimed at hitting the United States from the south. But that fact, that the withdrawal of the missiles in Turkey was obscured for decades, not publicized. So Khrushchev and Kennedy were in touch with each other constantly, directly by teletype or indirectly through emissaries. And the two embassies in Washington and Moscow played an invaluable role. We've forgotten all that, apparently.
Yes, that's an interesting point you were making about the tendencies to forget. Um, and another thing that I, from my perspective, I, I'm always surprised that there's no mention in the conversations or even in the media. 20 million Russian civilians were murdered by an invasion that came from outside and from this side of their border. It's almost as if that was only 80 years ago, that it seems to be almost forgotten. There's an irrationality.
It explains a lot about the Russian mentality. If you look at the geography of your continent, well, Ireland's off the continent, fortunately for you. If you look at the geography, there is nothing between Moscow and the Pyrenees except flat plains, which are easily crossed by armies, and indeed have been by Napoleon, by Hitler. There is nothing to the east of Moscow, to the Kamchatka Peninsula, except frozen tundra, which is also easily traversed by armies, as the Mongols demonstrated in their takeover of Russia. You should not permit, you need a cordon sanitaire, you need a sort of belt of neutrality between you and potential enemies. And Ukraine ought to be such a neutral place. It should be both a buffer and a bridge between Russia and the rest of Europe. And that is exactly what it probably will end up being if things go right. But in the meantime, we don't know. Perhaps 1 million Ukrainians have died. Ukraine started its independence with 52 million inhabitants. By the time the war began, I'm sorry, not the war, but the invasion, because the war began in 2014. The invasion didn't happen until 2022. That number was down to about 32 million, because Ukraine's birth rate is the lowest in Europe. and many Ukrainians emigrated. Uh, Ukraine was in terrible condition for much of that period. Um, so 32 million, it's now down to about 20 million because 2.5 million, 3 million people have taken political asylum in Russia. And the remainder have taken political asylum in Europe, with 1.5 million of them in Poland and almost 1 million of them in Germany, and so on and so forth. Um, not any in the United States of any note, which is, belies our history as a refuge for people in need of one. Something that the Trump administration, I'm sad to say, is doubling down on, and worse, with mass deportations. Of course, we all dislike having too many foreigners in our presence, I suppose. Um, but in Ireland's case, you've done pretty well by letting them in, I think. And I'd argue we have too.
Yes, absolutely. Ireland has hugely benefited um, by the diversity that has emerged because of the immigrants coming in here. Um, before I want to just ask some or bring the subject across to Gaza and Israel. Just one final thing. Um, what I'm also surprised by, when there are people that are very reputable saying and giving a narrative, for example, like yourself being one of them, uh, but here in Ireland, I'm not sure how aware we are. For example, if we take Professor John Mersheimer, Professor of Political Science at the University of Chicago, and he is, it seems, a very reputable and respected individual worldwide. And he makes the very strong point that the war was primarily provoked by US and the West. So I'd love if some of the Irish radio stations would interview him. And then there's Jeffrey Sachs, Professor Jeffrey Sachs at Columbia University, who has an extraordinary worldwide reputation, and he is a very emphatic that it is America and the West that have primarily created this. I'm not saying I agree or disagree. I'm just making the point that their voice isn't being heard. And I understand it's not even been heard in America very well.
Well, this is exactly what I was referring to in terms of political correctness. The mainstream media, which are now almost all under oligopolies, Mr. Murdoch and others controlling them, will not give access to dissenting voices. And so what we hear is what our governments wish us to hear, or what the lowest common denominator of discourse turns out to be. So there really hasn't been much pushback. And it's kind of you to say that I have been effective in speaking out. I have not been. I have a voice that is also subject to censorship. Um, and if I have a view of reality that doesn't coincide with the narrative, I'm ruled out of order. Well, there you have it. And we're seeing a great deal of this now in Europe and to some extent the United States, although in the United States we're distracted by a constitutional crisis in which the elected president is taking a sledgehammer to our Bill of Rights and to our institutions, which is a bit distracting. But in Europe, we're hearing, oh my God, how could they possibly how could Trump possibly do this? Well, the answer is that while he's wacko on a lot of subjects, he's realistic on a few. And this happens to be one of them.
Yeah, absolutely. So actually, you are quite effective because we Irish are hearing you now, and you see, so it's having an impact on me what you're sharing. So you are affecting me in a way in which has me considering aspects that previously I wouldn't have been so clearly aware of. Um, so on the subject of Gaza, there, I, I wonder. I think I've mentioned that I lived in America for 3 years. I sort of always have loved the place when I'm there. Um, but what mystifies me is how really is it so? Is the Israeli lobby has such power to control American governments? It seems an extraordinary power that a small country like Israel would have.
Well, I think a great deal of this is explained, of course, by the horrors of the Holocaust, which was a phenomenon in Europe, not in America. We liberated some of the death camps, although the major work was done by the Soviet Union, which is again something we don't like to acknowledge. People feel guilty, or they're subject to being made to feel guilty because they allowed genocide. And the genocide, by the way, was not just of Jews, it was of Romani, Gypsies, it was of liberals, it was of communists, it was a vast program of deliberate massacre of people whose only uh, crime was to be who they were and to believe what they did. And now we're seeing this again. And in the United States, let me tell you a story. Um, I can't remember exactly when it was, but I was in Abu Dhabi in the United Arab Emirates, or perhaps it was Dubai. I don't remember. But I did turn on the TV in my hotel room to watch the evening news in Arabic. And one of the items that was featured was a home movie from someone in Gaza, which at that time was still settled by the Israelis. They hadn't yet reduced it to a concentration camp, as they did later. And I saw two plainclothes Israeli police intelligence officers carry about a 17-year-old kid out of his house, beat the living daylights out of him, kick him in the head, and finally shoot him in the head and walk away laughing. And I thought to myself, when this hits the press back home, all hell is going to break out. But of course, it never appeared. And we are self-censoring. Our media is, as it has just shown in the case of Ukraine, entirely capable of preventing any opinion other than what is most convenient to the government or interest groups to hold forth. So we have a society in the United States now in which we claim to be a democracy, but in many respects, we are a plutocracy. And much of that plutocracy is Jewish and associated with Israel and sympathetic to it in the sense that I mentioned earlier. And we now have the odd phenomenon of people who grew up under apartheid in South Africa in positions of authority, imposing racist policies on us. And of course, Israel and South Africa during the era of apartheid were great buddies and worked together to build the nuclear weapons that both have and test them. So, I mean, I dealt with South Africa, which was under apartheid, which was fascinating, but hardly a delight. Anyway, we now have these people. We've even gone in the United States so far that Mr. Trump has just declared that Afrikaners, white South Africans, are now in danger of persecution and therefore should be admitted on a priority basis as refugees, whereas no one else should be admitted as a refugee. And of course, South Africa, 7% of South Africans are white. They own 70% of the land. That is the result of apartheid. And so the government has passed a law which establishes a procedure for expropriating unused land and redistributing it to the Black African farmers. But the fact is, no such expropriation has yet taken place. And so what we have is the resentments of Elon Musk, Peter Thiel, somebody Sachs, David Sachs, I think, who are all expatriate South Africans who went through the trauma of the dismantlement of apartheid, which, by the way, U.S. Agency for International Development was heavily involved in. I think that accounts for a good deal of Mr. Musk's enmity toward USAID. Well, in that case, perhaps we got the wrong immigrants. But we do have a plutocracy that manipulates our elections. I make a final point here that I think, in a sense, all of this in the United States may be self-correcting. Only 60% of Americans voted in the last election. 13 million previous voters did not show up at the polls. Mr. Trump got a 49.8% of those who voted, not a majority, a very strong plurality. Kamala Harris, his principal opponent, fell short. I think she got about 47%, and the remainder were protest votes for third-party candidates of one sort or another. So when he says he has a mandate from something below 30% of adult Americans. And what he's doing is destroying government services, creating chaos, interrupting everything, to the point where Joseph Stiglitz, a Nobel Prize-winning economist of world renown, says the United States is no longer investable, that he wouldn't advise any foreigner to invest in the United States, and that Americans should hold their investments until things settle down, the dust clears. So we are in a parlous state, and that, I think, accounts for a good deal of the erratic behavior that you see.
Yes. And just going back to Israel, one of the things that I think has been caused a dramatic shift in awareness. I mean, most people in the West would not have been aware of what was taking place in Israel and the way the Palestinians were being treated from the very inception of the state of Israel. But then you have, because of this extraordinary, what appears to be a genocide in Gaza, it's sort of opened the box to some degree, and people are hearing about people like the historian Ilan Pappé, the Jewish historian, Israeli historian, who has written extensively about the Jewish state since its inception and the way the Palestinians have been treated. So I think that's at least bringing some sort of balance into the situation. Not everybody is acknowledging that, but nonetheless, it is happening. And I've had correspondence with the Israeli ambassador to Ireland. I wrote to her, it was about last June, and she replied. And in my correspondence, I was sharing information with her that I wasn't sure if she would have been aware of or not. Like, for example, the historical records that the historian Ilan Pappé and others have brought from the archives. And I sometimes feel when the Irish media were interviewing Dana Ehrlich, who was the ambassador, they were not really asking I felt, what would have been very decisive questions, like, for example, why are so many Israelis opposed to what's happening in Gaza? Have you read what Ilan Papa has written? But those sort of questions didn't seem to be asked. Uh, but in any case, I just mentioned that as something that is now coming more into because I've been to Israel 3 times, and the first time I went, I had no idea what was going on there. But now I'm aware. And the question is, would I be aware as much as I am now if this genocide hadn't happened? So,
Probably not. I think, let me make a number of comments. Ilan Pape is a wonderful example of what is best about Judaism. I'm not Jewish, but I admire the tradition of truth telling, which is why we have prophets in the Bible who are Jewish. But we have a group of people, he's one of them, who are fearless in their pursuit of truth and in their pursuit of justice. And he deserves every respect. But of course, in Israel, he is subject to denial. And he's actually been accused of being a Nazi because he opposes genocide, which is an interesting definition of a Nazi, not one that I would accept. As for whether there is genocide or not, I think we need to pay tribute to TikTok, which for young people has been a mechanism for showing reality as they perceive it directly, without filters. And it is exactly why the Israel lobby has set an objective in the United States of banning TikTok. It's got nothing to do with Chinese espionage and everything to do with the fact that it has succeeded in changing American opinion among youth, at least, including Jewish youth, to a majority that don't want to have anything to do with Israel's behavior or to be associated with it, and recognize that we are entirely complicit in everything Israel's done. It couldn't conduct the war for a minute if we were not supplying both funding and weaponry. Final point. As to whether there is genocide or not, there were 2.3 million Palestinians, we believe, in Gaza at the start of this war of annihilation. Mr. Trump has said that who plans to redevelop Gaza and turn it into a resort with a Trump Tower and Trump International Hotel, to which Palestinians need not apply for lodging, says there are now 1.7 million Palestinians to be removed, ethnically cleansed. The other day, another estimate I saw from Israel was that there were 1.9 million Palestinians. But where did the 400,000 or 600,000 go? So I don't think there's any question. And I note that the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court have meticulously examined the evidence and concluded that there is. So has Human Rights Watch, so has Amnesty International, so has B'Tselem, the Israeli human rights organization. So I don't think there's any question here, unless you are a true believer in Zionism, which many are.
yes, I agree, actually. Uh, I realize that this conversation has gone on nearly an hour, and it is fascinating listening to you, Ambassador.
I suppose really, I mean, there's so much to ask, but just with all of your experience and everything, where do you think we're headed? I know this is a huge question, but I think it's one that's in all of our minds. Having grown up during the Cold War and seeing all of this, I find it insane the world we're in now, and very hard to track and try and see where we're headed. But have you any ideas, or with all of your experience in diplomacy and everything like that, where is it going to end up even in 4 years' time, or if you even have any kind of thing you could share with us?
Well, I'll try. I mean, I think there were elements of the Cold War, which I participated in as a diplomat, that were insane. So insanity is not quite as novel as you may imply. where are we headed? First of all, we're headed into turmoil, obviously. I think, let me break that down a little bit. The message that the Trump administration just delivered at the Munich Security Conference, the main message was we're reorienting ourselves toward the Pacific and away from the Atlantic. And therefore, you Europeans who have for 80 years depended upon us to keep order in Europe are going to have to find your own means of keeping order. That was the message. I note that Antonio Costa, who's the president of the European Council, has said that Europe must now negotiate a new security architecture with Russia. It will take Europeans some time to come to agreement with him because of the shock that we've been discussing, the fact that they had misperceived reality as a result of an information warfare. But they will come to that conclusion. And since Ireland is part of the EU, you may be part of the rational voices, one of the rational voices that encourages realism where there has been delusion. Having said that, 27 countries are no better than 27 people at reaching consensus. And Europe can't apparently make decisions. And we just saw this, as I mentioned earlier, in the meeting at Paris, which was truncated. You know, Italy was silent. Germany was opposed to sending troops to Ukraine. The UK said it would send troops, but then qualified it only if the Americans went too, which we've said we won't. And of course, the whole idea of NATO forces in Ukraine is exactly what provoked the Russians into the war in the first place. So there will be, I don't know what will happen in Europe. I'm not European. I lost that qualification 400 years ago when my ancestors moved here. So that's one thing. It's not clear to me. There are other elements, of course, in play. There is Mr. Trump's delusion that foreigners, not Americans, pay tariffs. They're a tax on us, not on the countries from which we import. We're very dependent on imports. We have been abusing the strength of the US dollar with promiscuous sanctions on virtually everyone, with the result that the role of the dollar as the universal method of trade settlement, settling transactions, is now in jeopardy. We have created a gathering, initially the BRICS, now an expanded BRICS, which began essentially as a protest movement against American hegemony, but which is now developing into an actual rule-setting body and has created institutions like the New Development Bank to remedy the stasis, inefficiency, lack of reform in the World Bank, for example. And we have China creating institutions like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which the United States is almost alone in boycotting. Interestingly, the AIIB follows precisely the same rules as the World Bank, with one difference. In order to apply for project finance at the AIIB, you don't have to be a member, whereas you must be a member of the World Bank to get the benefit of its financing. So the world is changing. The new institutions are being created. There is a call for new institutions, new security arrangements. I'll make I guess, one could go on and on and on. I don't want to do that. So I will just say that I don't think the characterization that the Biden administration put forward on world affairs, namely that they were organized around two great struggles, one between democracy and autocracy, and the other between great power rivalries. I don't think either of these was correct. And on the latter point, great power rivalry, one of the most interesting phenomena that we're observing is the reemergence of middle-ranking powers as forces in their own right. It's not an accident that Saudi Arabia, which aspires to such a role globally, was the site of the Russian-American meeting a few days ago. And we can look at, Turkey as another example, and Brazil. What we're seeing is the emergence of what I call a multinodal world order, not multipolar. A pole is a line between 2 points. And the ends of the line are called poles. But what we're experiencing is the emergence of nodes, which are three-dimensional, not two-dimensional, can evolve, can turn, can accommodate thick connections and thin connections, and operate in 3 dimensions. So this is why we see, countries, some European, who still pretend to be world powers, the French, for example. They're not world powers. They're not even able to hold their empire together in Africa these days. But they are a force as a middle-ranking power. Japan is similar, reemerging from its shell in the American occupation, becoming not just an economic player in Pacific Asia, but an increasingly active political military player. So the world we knew, the bipolar order that you referred to in the Cold War, is no more. And that had its defects, but this is vastly more confusing, and requires a nimbleness in diplomacy that we didn't have during the Cold War. Diplomacy in the Cold War resembled nothing so much as trench warfare. Once in a while, we'd do a little reconnaissance over the line, but with no expectation we could expand into enemy territory. And we fought in no man's lands. In the Third World, we had proxy wars. We were very careful not to have a direct war. We now face the danger of direct war, nuclear war. And you can see this in China's recognition that it can no longer afford to have a minimalist, force de frappe, sort of strike force that would take a bite out of some other country that attacked it with nuclear weapons. It now has to embrace mutual assured destruction, very appropriately spelled out MAD, MAD. So we're going to have, in a few years, we'll have 1,500 Chinese nuclear-armed ICBMs pointed at the United States, which is enough to totally destroy us, and then some. This is not the world that we were familiar with. It could resemble Europe in the 19th century in a sense. And this is my hope, that just as happened at the Congress of Vienna and the Concert of Europe, which managed a balance of power between multiple parties, was created, kept the peace more or less, a few hiccups like the Franco-Prussian War and the Crimean War, but kept the peace more or less for a century until 1914. I'm hoping we can learn from this. We can have an inclusive order. We can have an order in which no one is allowed to exercise overall hegemony. And here, I guess I'll finish this. And I see Mr. English has a question, and I'll finish this by just noting that we made a terrible mistake. The world made a terrible mistake. Ireland was a bit preoccupied at the time, I understand. But after World War I, instead of including everyone with power in Europe in a gathering, we decided to excommunicate Germany and Russia. And the result was World War II. And I would argue also the Cold War. We can't afford to do that. We need to emulate what Metternich and others did in Vienna in 1815, and that is include the enemy. The French were brought back in, even though they had been guilty of enormous disruption of European order and many, many killings. So I'll stop here. That's a ramble. I'm sorry if it's incoherent, but I now turn to Mr. English, who is there you are. You're muted, or not. I'm not sure.
No, you're not muted. Go ahead.
No, you're okay.
Oh, yeah. Thanks very much, Ambassador. I think you really answered what I was going to say. It's an old Chinese, I think it's a Chinese proverb that crisis and opportunity kind of are the same thing. So you kind of covered that there is an opportunity in the world that we wouldn't have had if the Democrats had won that election in America. If Kamala Harris was there, it would be more of the same militarization and war. So maybe there is an opportunity here. And just from a European perspective, I'm a European, and I really, my gripe is with the European leaders over the last 3 years. And it's exactly what Donald Trump has said today or yesterday. What were they doing for 3 years? Not one ounce of diplomacy that they look to try and solve, only just demonization of, and it was so annoying. And I mean, we re-elected in the European Parliament elections there a few months ago. We put back in the very same people. So that's kind of depressing from my perspective. Thanks very much.
Well, your reference to the Chinese ideogram for crisis combines the elements of danger and opportunity. There are two ideograms, and the word for challenge in Chinese is crisis and opportunity. So they do incorporate. I think there is an opportunity, but you referred to European leaders. Precisely who are they? What leaders? You know, Henry Kissinger asked the question: if I want to talk to Europe, what's the phone number? Who do I call? Do we know the answer to that? I'd say that the last weekend's gathering in Paris suggests we don't. So Europeans have had the luxury of living under the mostly benign, sometimes malign protection of the United States. And you now got to get your act together. And the question is, are you able to do that? And maybe because the Irish saved civilization once, you'll do it again. Mr. Dawson. Unmute.
Jonathan. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your time, Ambassador Freeman. It's a great opportunity to hear from you directly like this. My question kind of leads on from the general questioning around Europe, and I'm just picking up on something that Mearsheimer once said, which was that the Europeans are caught in a trap because they are up until 1945 they were involved in security conflict, and after 1945 with the post-war settlement, the Americans were there with their umbrella of security, so the Europeans could relax. They didn't have to worry about biting each other, and now we're looking at this situation where America is disappearing, which obviously we had a taste of it from 2016 to 2020. And, the last 3 weeks, particularly the last 3 weeks, I think there's been this insane narrative in all the countries in Europe about getting a European army together, and everybody's got to increase their military GDP, just crazy stuff. Like this is like we're the sort of stuff that was going on before World War I, where everyone was racing to get the arms together and get their militaries beefed up and everything. I just never thought I'd see anything like this. But I'm wondering, just a curiosity, what you think about the idea that, is this desire to create a Russian enemy, such a strong desire to create a Russian enemy. I'm just wondering if there's or if you feel that there might be some sort of a latent fear in the European sort of arena, that if they don't have a strong enemy, that they're just going to start going at each other again. So yeah, just your comments on that.
Well, I think enemy deprivation syndrome is operating. This is the sense of disquiet and disorientation you get when your enemy irresponsibly drops dead on you or ceases to menace you. And I'd say a lot of the nonsense that's being talked about on the continent is demonstrably false. I mean, Russia hasn't even been able to muster a conquest of Ukraine, let alone march on through Denmark and end up somewhere in Madrid. This is not going to happen. So we are left with the legacy of the Cold War era, in which the Russian boogeyman played an enormously effective role in keeping Europe together and the United States there. And so we had the purpose of NATO to keep the Americans in, the Germans down, and the Russians out. That was the whole logic of it. Well, now after 80 years, not surprisingly, since Europe is prosperous and presumably should be able to take care of itself, Americans are wondering, well, why should we bear the burden? And of course, we've adopted a completely stupid approach previously to persuading Europeans to stand up for themselves, because we said you've got to spend 2% of your GDP on defense. But then we mutter quietly off stage, and if you don't, we'll do it for you, which rather disincentivizes anything happening. But now there are major incentives for Europeans actually to address the issue. The problem that you referred to, talking about turning the Western European Union, the WEU, into some kind of potent fighting force. It's actually a tea party, not a military. But turning that into a fighting force is exactly the wrong thing to do. That is a military solution to a problem that is political. And what Mr. Putin said in December 2021, what he said in Munich in 2007 was, we need a political solution to the question of order in Europe. And instead of getting an answer, he got a rebuff. Well, Europeans are going to have to find a political solution. Now, what that is, I'm not qualified to say. I have, well, of course, I've had a fair amount of contact with the European Commission over the years, and I've always thought of it like sticking your head in the oven and turning on the gas. Basically soporific and inconclusive. So Europeans are going to have to come to grips with this. It is a moment to look at American history, because even though we've forgotten it, we do have history. The Articles of Confederation, which were our first constitutional arrangement after 1783, when we persuaded the British with some difficulty that we were entitled to be independent, and lost our qualification to be part of the Commonwealth as a result. We had Articles of Confederation that were very loose and allowed each state to do its own thing, much like the EU allows its own states to do their own thing. My own home state of Rhode Island actually refused to ratify the constitution that was put in place of the Articles of Confederation, for the simple reason that our principal business was smuggling, and we feared that a strong federal government would interfere with that. That was correct, as it turned out. So we ratified at the point of a bayonet. George Washington literally sent the army to Providence, Rhode Island, and said, you either sign the Constitution or we're going to kill you, which was quite persuasive. Anyway, so I think Europe is at such a moment, or to look at European history, Europe is at a moment rather like the Peace of Westphalia, which took 4 years, involved negotiations in multiple fora, and yet established a new doctrine for European relationships, the doctrine of sovereign equality of states, and the doctrine that cuius religio, cuius, cuius, I can't remember what it is in Latin, but whatever your faith is, you're entitled to that religion in your country. So I think Europe has had a similar moment. Can you rise to the occasion? There's a lot of people around the world who hope you do, because they want a multinodal world in which Europe plays a major role. And as an American, I strongly hope you do, because we were founded on the Enlightenment principles that Europeans created. And we are abandoning those principles. And we need to be reminded of them, and we need to have a partner who demands that we follow them. So go to it.
So if there aren't then any other questions, just to finish up then, first of all, obviously I want to thank Ambassador Freeman for so generously giving his time and his knowledge, and he won't agree with me when I say this, his wisdom, because I think it's been an extremely informative evening, which links in to the fact that this missing information, Ambassador Freeman has now filled in a lot of the gaps of missing information, which I hope when this recording of this is sent to all our politicians and our media, they take note. However, I'm also aware that there's a tendency for people to respond to this type of presentation that Ambassador Freeman has given us with the statement that those in the Kremlin will be delighted to hear what has been said tonight. And of course, that's a sort of a mindless response to not really listening. And an interesting quote is appropriate to defend against that. Andreas Rubers, German cabaret artist, author, and musician, said the following: "If I say something right that pleases the wrong people, then the right thing does not automatically become wrong." And I think there is wisdom in that.
Indeed.
So a couple of other things I just want to mention quickly. And as I've thanked Ambassador Freeman, I also want to thank Mark Price, who has been a great help in this whole event and has been there to also be able to operate the Zoom. One of my only disappointments about the evening is I had gone to the hairdresser today, got a lovely job done on my hair because I wanted to show it off. Obviously, God interfered. He doesn't like pride, I think. The other thing I just want to say too, I mentioned at the start that I spent the last 35 years exploring a new form of dialogue. And just if anybody's interested, on Google, if you Google a new form of dialogue and then my name, Eddie O'Brien, you will see a presentation that's on YouTube that I gave on that subject. I've also just to finally want to say that obviously I was well aware of the huge amount of credentials that Ambassador Freeman has. However, I discovered during the week that his most important credential of all, and I hadn't mentioned it at the beginning, is that Ambassador Freeman and his wife have Irish blood flowing joyously through their veins. And that is an extraordinary credential because Ambassador Freeman has mentioned about the book, How the Irish Saved Civilization. And it simply means that we may have to do it all over again. And however, and it is an extraordinary book, How the Irish Saved Civilization. If any of you had not read it or heard about it. But what the Irish achieved that time in saving civilization and the extraordinary contribution they made was because we were our own individual country. If we lose our neutrality, or even if it is compromised down to the point in which it's only a word, but no longer a reality, we will not save civilization again. It wouldn't be possible. So, on that note, thank you all for being here. Thank those who asked those interesting questions. And we then say good night.
Well, may I thank all of you for joining this and putting up with the rambling presentation that I made. Thank you very much and have a pleasant evening.
Thank you.